The symphony of the apocalypse played its familiar tune across the abandoned streets of what had once been Portland. Broken glass crunched beneath careful footsteps, while distant moans carried on the wind like a mournful chorus. Kestrel Moreau pressed herself against the crumbling brick wall of a pharmacy, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid morning air. 3 months had passed since the first outbreak, and the world had transformed into something unrecognizable, yet somehow she still found reasons to keep moving forward. Through the grimy window beside her, Kestrel could see them, the infected, wandering aimlessly through the aisles, their gray skin mottled with decay, their movements jerky and purposeless. She counted 7, maybe 8. Too many for her to handle alone, but not impossible if she was smart about it. Her fingers traced the handle of the knife strapped to her thigh, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The blade had been a gift from her grandfather, back when the world made sense, back when the biggest worry was whether it would rain during her college graduation ceremony. The radio clipped to her belt crackled softly, barely audible. "Kestrel, do you copy?" The voice belonged to Thane Okafor, the closest thing their ragtag group had to a leader. His calm Nigerian accent had become an anchor of stability in their chaotic new reality. "Status report." She pressed the transmit button twice, their signal for all clear but proceeding with caution. Speaking aloud would be suicide this close to infected territory. The pharmacy held supplies they desperately needed, antibiotics for young Zephyr's fever, insulin for Cashin's diabetes, and basic medical supplies that had become more valuable than gold. Their makeshift camp, hidden in the basement of an old church 5 blocks away, had become home to 17 survivors, including 3 children who still remembered bedtime stories and birthday wishes. Kestrel studied the infected through the window, noting their patterns. The outbreak had changed everything about human behavior, but somehow the infected retained fragments of their former selves. The woman in the nurse's uniform still gravitated toward the medical supplies section. The man in the baseball cap kept returning to the magazine rack, turning pages with decomposing fingers. It was heartbreaking and terrifying in equal measure, watching these echoes of humanity shamble through their final act. A soft sound made her freeze, footsteps, but too coordinated to belong to the infected. She turned slowly and saw Indira Vasquez emerging from the shadows of an overturned delivery truck. The former emergency room doctor had insisted on coming despite Thane's protests. Her dark eyes met Kestrel's, and she held up a small device that looked like a modified hearing aid. One of her latest inventions, designed to detect infected heartbeats or the lack thereof. Indira had become their early warning system, her medical knowledge combined with her engineering background proving invaluable in their new world. The two women moved in practiced synchronization, communicating through hand signals developed over weeks of dangerous supply runs. Indira pointed to the rear entrance of the pharmacy, then held up 3 fingers, 3 infected in the back room, separate from the main group. They could split up, draw the infected away from each other, and clear the building systematically. It wasn't the first time they'd executed such a plan, and Kestrel found comfort in the familiar routine of survival. But as they prepared to move, something unusual caught Kestrel's attention. Through the front window, she could see movement in the building across the street, deliberate, human movement. A small figure pressed against a second-story window, waving frantically. A child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with tears streaming down dirt-stained cheeks. Behind the child, shadows moved in ways that made Kestrel's stomach clench with dread. The pharmacy mission suddenly became secondary. That child represented something precious in their broken world, innocence that deserved protection, a future worth fighting for. Kestrel felt the familiar weight of choice settling on her shoulders. Save the child and risk everything, or complete their mission and live with the knowledge that they'd abandoned someone who might still be saved. Indira had seen it too. Her expression reflected the same internal struggle. They both understood that in this new world, difficult choices were the currency of survival. Every decision carried the weight of life and death, not just for themselves but for everyone depending on them back at the church. The antibiotics Zephyr needed, the insulin that kept Cashin alive, the basic supplies that meant the difference between their community thriving or slowly dying, all of it hung in the balance. The child's desperate waving grew more frantic, and Kestrel could almost hear the silent plea across the distance. In that moment, she realized that hope wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying human, about choosing to care for others even when caring hurt. The world might be falling apart, but as long as people like them existed, people willing to risk everything for a stranger's child, humanity had a chance. The decision crystallized between heartbeats. Kestrel touched Indira's arm and pointed toward the building where the child waited. Without hesitation, the doctor nodded, understanding passing between them like electricity. They would save the child first, then figure out how to complete their original mission. Some choices transcended logic, rooted instead in the fundamental belief that certain things remained worth dying for. Moving with practiced stealth, they approached the building from its blind side. The structure had once housed a small bookstore on the ground floor, with apartments above. Now broken windows gaped like wounded eyes, and the front door hung askew on rusted hinges. Kestrel could smell the distinctive odor of decay that always accompanied large groups of infected, sweet and cloying, mixing with the acrid scent of urban deterioration. Indira's heartbeat detector indicated at least 15 infected on the ground floor, their sluggish pulses registering as faint blips on her jury-rigged screen. The stairwell leading to the second floor appeared clear, but appearances had killed more survivors than anything else in this new world. They needed a distraction, something to draw the infected away from their intended path. From her backpack, Kestrel retrieved one of Lyra Montrose's sound devices. The teenager back at their camp had proven surprisingly adept at creating tools for misdirection, small mechanical toys that could produce various noises on timers. This particular device mimicked the sound of a crying baby, guaranteed to attract any infected within a 2-block radius. It was cruel in its effectiveness, exploiting the fragmentary human instincts that still lurked within the infected minds. They positioned the device in an alley 2 buildings down, setting its timer for 60 seconds. As they waited, Kestrel found herself thinking about Lyra, barely 18 but already hardened by loss in ways that made her seem decades older. The girl had lost her parents in the first wave of infections but had channeled her grief into helping others survive. Her innovations had saved dozens of lives, yet she still woke most nights screaming from nightmares that no one her age should have to endure. The device activated with a piercing wail that cut through the morning air like a blade. Within moments, the infected began their migration toward the sound, shambling with single-minded purpose. Kestrel watched them stream past the bookstore's windows, their gray faces turned toward the source of the noise with expressions that might have been hunger or might have been sorrow. When the building had emptied sufficiently, they moved. The stairwell reeked of death and human waste, but they climbed quickly, stepping over debris and avoiding the darker stains on the walls. The second-floor hallway stretched before them, lined with doors that had been barricaded with furniture and hope. Most stood open now, their barriers breached, their stories of desperate resistance written in scratches on the walls and bloodstains on the floor. The child's voice led them to apartment 2C, a whispered pleading that grew clearer as they approached. "Please, please, somebody help us. They're trying to get in." The voice belonged to a girl, probably 9 or 10, speaking with the careful enunciation of someone trying to stay quiet while fighting panic. Kestrel pressed her ear to the door and heard shuffling, scraping sounds from within. Not the random movement of infected, but the deliberate actions of someone building or reinforcing a barricade. A second voice joined the first, older, male, speaking in what sounded like Portuguese. The girl translated in urgent whispers, "My grandfather says they've been trapped for 2 days. The infected broke into the building yesterday morning." Through the keyhole, Kestrel could see a slice of the apartment's interior. Furniture had been stacked against what was probably the main window, and she could make out movement in the gaps, the infected on the fire escape, pressing against the glass, their decomposing hands leaving smears with each attempt to break through. Indira examined the door's locking mechanism and shook her head. The survivors inside had barricaded from within, which meant opening it would require their cooperation. But trust had become a luxury few could afford. How many survivors had died because they'd opened doors to the wrong people? How many had been betrayed by those they'd tried to help? "Listen to me," Kestrel whispered through the keyhole, her voice barely audible even to Indira standing beside her. "My name is Kestrel. I'm here with a doctor. We're going to get you out, but I need you to stay calm and do exactly what I say." The shuffling stopped. After a moment, the girl's voice came back, thick with tears of relief. "Are you real? We've been hearing voices for days, but they weren't." "We're real," Indira confirmed, her medical training evident in the calm authority of her voice. "Sweetie, what's your name?" "Esperanza Silva. My grandfather is Manuel. He doesn't speak much English, but he understands some. The fire escape, there are so many of them out there." Kestrel studied the situation through the limited view afforded by the keyhole. The apartment's layout suggested two possible exit routes: the main door they were standing at, or the fire escape currently occupied by infected. Neither option would be simple, but they'd faced worse odds before and survived through careful planning and what Thane liked to call controlled audacity. The sound device in the alley had stopped, which meant they had perhaps 10 minutes before the infected began wandering back to their original positions. 10 minutes to devise a plan that would save 2 lives without sacrificing their own or compromising their mission to save 17 others back at the church. In this new world, mathematics had become a form of brutal morality, where the arithmetic of survival left no room for sentiment. But looking at Indira's determined expression, seeing the fierce protectiveness that had made her such an invaluable member of their group, Kestrel knew they would find a way. They always did. Hope, she had learned, wasn't just about believing things would get better. It was about refusing to let the darkness extinguish your willingness to try. The plan formed quickly, born from desperation and refined by experience. Kestrel would create a second distraction using their remaining sound device, drawing the infected away from the fire escape. Meanwhile, Indira would guide the grandfather and granddaughter down the building's interior stairs and out through the rear exit. It wasn't elegant, but elegance was a luxury they couldn't afford when lives hung in the balance. "Esperanza," Kestrel whispered through the keyhole, "I need you to tell your grandfather that we're going to make noise outside. When you hear it, count to 30, then move the furniture away from the door. Can you do that?" The girl's response came immediately, already translating rapid Portuguese to her grandfather before answering in English. "He says yes, but he wants to know about the ones on the fire escape. They've been trying to break the window all morning." Indira checked her heartbeat detector, frowning at the readings. 12 signatures on the fire escape, maybe more stacked below the sensor's range. That window isn't going to hold much longer. Even as she spoke, they could hear the rhythmic thumping of decomposing fists against glass, an irregular percussion that had probably been driving the trapped family mad with terror. Time compressed around them as it always did during moments of crisis. Kestrel moved to the window at the hallway's end, studying the street below. The infected were already beginning to drift back from their first distraction, moving with the purposeless wandering that characterized their kind between feeding frenzies. She positioned their second sound device on the roof of a car directly below, setting its timer for 2 minutes, enough time to get back to Esperanza's door before it activated. The device was one of Lyra's more sophisticated creations, designed to mimic multiple voices calling for help. It would draw every infected within 3 blocks, creating a feeding frenzy focused on an empty car while they evacuated the building. The psychological weight of using recorded human voices as bait had troubled several members of their group, but survival often required them to weaponize the very humanity they were fighting to preserve. As they waited for the timer to count down, Kestrel found herself thinking about the moral complexity of their situation. Every choice carried consequences that rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. Save these 2 people, and they might lose precious medical supplies. Fail to save them, and they would carry the weight of avoidable deaths. The mathematics of survival had become a cruel calculus where every decision extracted its toll in blood or conscience. The first recorded voice echoed across the street, "Help me. Please, somebody help me." It was Lyra's voice, recorded during one of her more creative moments. The effect was immediate and devastating. Infected began streaming toward the sound from every direction, their shambling gaits quickening to something approaching urgency. Whatever remained of their human instincts, the drive to respond to distress calls seemed hardwired into their decaying nervous systems. "Now," Kestrel whispered, and heard immediate movement from inside apartment 2C. The scraping of furniture being moved, the creak of old wood under strain, and Manuel's steady Portuguese instructions to his granddaughter. Through the keyhole, she could see Esperanza's small hands working to move a chair that probably weighed more than she did. The door opened slowly, revealing a thin girl with enormous dark eyes and her grandfather, a man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent working under harsh suns. Manuel held a kitchen knife in one hand and his granddaughter's fingers in the other, his protective stance speaking a universal language that needed no translation. Behind them, their apartment told a story of terror and resilience, furniture stacked against windows, water collected in every available container, and the careful rationing of supplies that meant the difference between hope and despair. "Esperanza, Manuel," Indira said softly, her voice carrying the kind of professional calm that could soothe patients even in emergency situations. "We're going to move quickly but quietly down the stairs. Stay between us, and if something goes wrong, do exactly what we tell you immediately." The girl translated rapidly, and her grandfather nodded once, his grip on the knife never loosening. In his eyes, Kestrel saw the same blend of fear and determination that had become familiar among survivors. These were people who had watched their world end but had chosen to keep fighting for whatever remained. As they prepared to leave the apartment, a tremendous crash echoed from the fire escape side of the building. The window had finally given way, and the infected were pouring into apartment 2C like water through a broken dam. Their timing had been measured in minutes, possibly seconds. Any delay, any hesitation, and Esperanza and Manuel would have become another statistic in humanity's declining population. The sound of breaking glass was followed by the distinctive moans of infected discovering that their prey had escaped. Frustration seemed to be one emotion that carried over from their human lives, and disappointed infected were often more dangerous than hungry ones. They would search the building systematically now, following scent trails and heat signatures with the persistence of the damned. Moving down the stairwell required a different kind of courage than the adrenaline-fueled bravery of combat. This was the slow burn of sustained terror, where every creaking board threatened to announce their presence and every shadow might conceal death. Manuel moved with surprising grace for his age, his work-hardened hands finding stable grips on the railing while his eyes swept continuously for threats. Esperanza stayed close to Indira, drawing comfort from the doctor's steady presence. They reached the ground floor to find it mercifully empty, the infected having followed their audio lure into the street. But emptiness in this new world was often temporary, and they could already hear movement above as the infected in apartment 2C began their search. Time remained their most precious resource, ticking away with the inexorable precision of a countdown to catastrophe. The rear exit of the building opened onto an alley that reeked of garbage and worse things. In the months since society's collapse, urban decay had accelerated beyond anything Kestrel could have imagined. Nature was already beginning to reclaim the spaces humanity had abandoned, with weeds pushing through cracked concrete and ivy creeping up walls like green fingers reaching for purchase in a dying world. Manuel spoke quietly to Esperanza as they moved through the alley, his voice carrying an undertone of wonder that made Kestrel glance back. The girl was smiling for the first time since they'd found her, translating her grandfather's words with obvious joy. "He says the sky looks bigger today. We haven't been outside in so long." It was such a simple observation, yet it struck Kestrel with unexpected force. In their struggle for survival, how often had they forgotten to notice the sky? When had they stopped seeing beauty in something as basic as open space above their heads? Manuel's comment reminded her that hope wasn't always about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Sometimes it lived in the quiet recognition that the world still held wonders worth preserving. Indira checked her heartbeat detector as they moved, confirming that their route remained clear. 3 blocks to the church, she whispered, but we need to swing wide around the pharmacy. The infected will start returning once that sound device runs out of power. The journey back to their sanctuary became a lesson in the small miracles that sustained human resilience. As they navigated the abandoned streets, Esperanza pointed out details that her grandfather found remarkable: a flowering bush that had grown through a crack in the sidewalk, a cat sitting in a sunbeam on a windowsill, completely unafraid of their passage. These moments of normalcy existed like islands of peace in an ocean of chaos, reminding them that life persisted even in the darkest circumstances. My grandfather was a gardener, Esperanza explained as they paused to let a small group of infected shuffle past an intersection. Before everything happened, he grew vegetables for 3 restaurants downtown. He says the plants don't know the world ended, so they keep growing anyway. The profound simplicity of that statement resonated through Kestrel's thoughts as they completed their cautious approach to the church. Plants didn't know the world had ended, so they kept growing anyway. Perhaps that was the secret to maintaining hope in hopeless times, acting as if the future still mattered, even when evidence suggested otherwise. The church had been their home for 6 weeks, chosen for its solid construction, multiple exits, and the basement that provided protection from both infected and hostile humans. More importantly, it carried symbolic weight that helped maintain morale during their darkest moments. There was something profoundly comforting about seeking sanctuary in a place designed for exactly that purpose, even if their threats were more tangible than spiritual. Thane met them at the side entrance, his relief evident despite his attempts to maintain leadership composure. "Status report," he said quietly, but his eyes were already cataloging their new arrivals with the practiced assessment of someone responsible for too many lives. 2 civilians extracted safely, Kestrel reported. The pharmacy mission was compromised. "We'll need to try again tomorrow, different approach." She didn't mention the medical supplies they'd failed to retrieve, the antibiotics that Zephyr needed, or the insulin that would keep Cashin alive. Those conversations would come later, in the privacy of their leadership meetings where difficult decisions could be made without demoralizing the group. Inside the church basement, their community had created something that resembled civilization. Sleeping areas were marked off with hanging blankets, providing the illusion of privacy that helped maintain human dignity. A central area served as dining room, meeting space, and social center, while one corner had been converted into Indira's medical station. The overall effect was surprisingly homey, a testament to humanity's ability to create order and comfort even in the most challenging circumstances. Esperanza's entrance caused a minor sensation among the group's children. Senna Blackwood, their 13-year-old scout, immediately took charge of introductions and integration. The older girl's nurturing instincts had emerged strongly since losing her own family, and she'd become something of a protective sister to their younger survivors. Watching her guide Esperanza toward the children's area, Kestrel felt a familiar mix of sadness and pride in how quickly these kids had been forced to mature. Manuel's integration proceeded differently but no less meaningfully. Orion Castellanos, their supply manager, immediately began communicating through a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, and gestures, discovering that the older man's expertise with plants might solve several of their long-term sustainability problems. The possibility of growing their own food, of creating something instead of merely scavenging, brought an energy to their discussions that had been absent for weeks. As evening settled over their community, Kestrel found herself sitting with Lyra near the small altar that still dominated one end of the basement. The teenager was working on another of her devices, but her hands moved with automatic precision while her attention focused on their new arrivals. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked quietly. "Risking everything for 2 people we didn't even know?" It was a question that had no easy answers, but watching Esperanza laugh with the other children while her grandfather shared gardening wisdom with fascinated adults, Kestrel felt certain of their choice. "I think," she said slowly, "that the moment we stop risking everything for people we don't know is the moment we stop being worth saving ourselves." The world outside might be falling apart, but inside their small sanctuary, hope was growing like Manuel's plants, quietly, persistently, and without needing permission from a broken world. Dawn brought the familiar ritual of resource assessment and planning that had become the cornerstone of their survival. In the church's main sanctuary, now converted to their primary meeting space, Thane spread out hand-drawn maps while various team members reported on supplies, equipment status, and the overnight security watch. The morning light filtering through stained glass windows created patterns of color across their makeshift conference table, a reminder of beauty that persisted despite everything. Manuel had spent his first full night among them learning the rhythms of their community, and his integration had proceeded with remarkable smoothness. Through Esperanza's translation and Orion's bilingual assistance, he'd already identified 3 locations within their secured perimeter where vegetables could be grown. More importantly, he'd recognized edible plants growing wild in areas they'd previously considered barren wasteland. "Show them the route you found," Esperanza urged her grandfather, pride evident in her voice. The old man produced a dirt-covered tuber from his pocket, explaining in rapid Portuguese while his granddaughter translated. "He says this grows everywhere around here, but people don't know it's food. One plant like this can feed a person for a whole day." Indira examined the root with professional interest, already considering its nutritional value and potential role in their dietary planning. Their food situation had been precarious since the beginning, relying on dwindling scavenged supplies and the occasional successful hunting expedition. The possibility of supplementing their diet with foraged foods could extend their survival timeline significantly. "There's more," Esperanza continued, her excitement building as she shared her grandfather's knowledge. "He knows which plants can help with sickness, and which ones can make water safer to drink. Before the gardens, before he worked in restaurants, he learned these things from his father in El Salvador. The value of such knowledge in their current circumstances was incalculable. Modern medicine remained available only through dangerous scavenging missions like the one they'd postponed at the pharmacy. Traditional remedies wouldn't replace antibiotics or insulin, but they could treat minor ailments and prevent small problems from becoming life-threatening emergencies. Cashin Moreau, Kestrel's younger cousin and their best scout, raised a concerning point. "The infected have been showing different behavior patterns lately. Yesterday I watched a group of them working together to break through a chain-link fence. Not the random bumping we usually see, but actual coordination." This news cast a shadow over their optimistic morning discussions. Evolution among the infected had been a persistent fear since the outbreak began. If they were developing higher cognitive functions or learning to work together strategically, every assumption about safety and tactics would need to be reconsidered. "How coordinated?" Thane asked, his leadership mask slipping enough to reveal genuine concern. "Tool use? Problem solving? Or just pack behavior?" "Hard to say definitively," Cashin admitted. "But they seemed to understand that lifting the fence bottom would create an opening. One held it up while others crawled through. Could be instinct, could be something more." Senna, who had been quietly observing from her position near the children's area, offered her own observation. "I've noticed they respond differently to different people. Like they can tell who's been around them longer versus newcomers. The ones that were here when we arrived ignore me completely now, but new infected still react to my presence." These behavioral changes represented a terrifying escalation of threat, but they also provided opportunities for adaptation. If the infected were developing predictable patterns, those patterns could be exploited. If they were learning, perhaps their learning could be misdirected or used against them. Lyra looked up from her latest device, a complex arrangement of mirrors and LED lights designed to confuse and disorient infected during escapes. "If they're getting smarter, we need to get more creative. Raw force isn't going to work forever." The discussion was interrupted by a soft knock on the sanctuary door. Zephyr Nightingale, barely 16 but serving as their primary communications operator, entered with news that shifted the entire tone of their meeting. "I've been monitoring radio frequencies like always," he said, his voice hoarse from the fever that had been plaguing him for days. "There's something you all need to hear." He activated their jury-rigged radio system, adjusting frequencies until a faint voice emerged from the static. The transmission was weak and intermittent, but the message was unmistakable. This is Dr. Sarah Chen at the Portland General Hospital Research Facility. Day 93 of isolation. If anyone is receiving this, we have made significant progress on understanding the infection mechanism. We believe we may have found a way to slow or reverse the early stages of transformation. The sanctuary fell silent except for the radio's crackling static. A potential cure, or at least treatment, represented everything they had been fighting toward. But Portland General Hospital sat in the heart of the most heavily infected area of the city, surrounded by thousands of the creatures they'd been desperately avoiding. "There's more," Zephyr continued, fine-tuning the signal. Dr. Chen's voice returned, fainter but still audible. "Our research team has been reduced to 4 members. We have perhaps 2 weeks of supplies remaining. We will continue broadcasting this message daily at noon until we can't anymore." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. For researchers, potentially holding the key to humanity's salvation, trapped in a building surrounded by infected. They had 2 weeks to plan and execute a rescue mission that would either save the world or kill them all in the attempt. Manuel spoke quietly to his granddaughter, who translated with tears in her eyes. He says that sometimes the most important seeds are planted in the darkest soil. He thinks this is one of those times. Looking around the sanctuary at faces filled with fear, determination, and something that might have been hope, Kestrel realized that Manuel was right. They had spent months merely surviving, but this was their chance to actually fight back. The world might be falling apart, but these humans, her humans, were about to do something extraordinary. The planning consumed the next 48 hours, every detail scrutinized and refined until their strategy resembled something between a military operation and an elaborate heist. Portland General Hospital represented the most dangerous location in their known territory, surrounded by the largest concentration of infected they'd encountered. The building itself stood like a monument to civilization's collapse, its windows dark except for a few floors where Dr. Chen's team maintained their desperate research. Thane had divided their group into specialized teams, each with specific responsibilities that played to individual strengths. Kestrel would lead the infiltration team consisting of herself, Cashin, and Senna. Their job was to reach Dr. Chen's laboratory, assess the research materials, and determine what could be extracted. Indira would command the extraction team with Orion and Lyra, responsible for creating escape routes and managing the medical evacuation of anyone requiring immediate care. Meanwhile, Zephyr would coordinate communications from their mobile command post, a reinforced van positioned 6 blocks from the hospital. His deteriorating condition had everyone concerned, but his expertise with their radio equipment made him irreplaceable for the mission. The fever that had been plaguing him showed signs of progression, and Indira's private diagnosis remained unspoken but clearly grave. "The infected patterns around the hospital are unlike anything we've seen elsewhere," Cashin reported during their final briefing. "They seem drawn to the building, but not in their usual random way. They're circling it, like they're guarding it." This observation troubled everyone, particularly given their recent discussions about evolved infected behavior. If the creatures were somehow aware of the research being conducted inside, it suggested a level of intelligence that would require completely new survival strategies. Manuel had insisted on contributing to the mission despite his age and unfamiliarity with their tactics. Through Esperanza's translation, he'd shared knowledge about hospital layouts from his years of visiting relatives during medical emergencies. More importantly, he'd identified several medicinal plants growing in the hospital's neglected courtyard that could supplement their medical supplies regardless of the mission's other outcomes. "My grandfather wants to come with you," Esperanza said during their final preparations, her voice small but determined. "He says the plants won't grow forever, and this might be the only chance to harvest them properly." The request sparked immediate debate among the leadership team. Manuel's knowledge was invaluable, but adding an untrained civilian to an already dangerous mission violated every principle of tactical safety they'd developed. Yet his botanical expertise might prove crucial if they encountered injured researchers or needed to create medical supplies from available materials. Lyra had been working frantically to prepare specialized equipment for the mission. Her latest creation was a sound-dampening device designed to mask their movement from infected with enhanced hearing. The technology was untested but represented their best hope for moving through the hospital's corridor without attracting attention from the creatures that had made it their territory. The device should give us about 30 minutes of reduced audio signature, she explained, adjusting the complex array of speakers and sound baffles. After that, the power cells will need replacement, and we'll be back to relying on natural stealth. 30 minutes would have to be enough. Intelligence gathered from radio communications with Dr. Chen suggested that her laboratory was located on the hospital's 7th floor, accessible through a service elevator that still had limited power. The researchers had been using the elevator shaft as their primary communication point, suggesting it remained relatively secure from infected intrusion. As evening approached, their final preparations took on an almost ceremonial quality. Equipment was checked and rechecked, weapons were cleaned and sharpened, and personal items were secured in case team members didn't return. The weight of potential sacrifice hung over everyone, but it was balanced by something more powerful, the possibility that their actions might restore hope to a broken world. Senna approached Kestrel privately as the sun set behind the stained glass windows. "I've been thinking about what happens if we don't make it back," the 13-year-old said with the matter-of-fact tone that had replaced childhood innocence among all their younger survivors. "The others, especially the little kids, they'll need to know it was worth trying." The conversation reminded Kestrel why she fought so hard to preserve their community. These children had lost their childhoods to circumstances beyond their control, but they'd maintained their capacity for hope and sacrifice. If humanity had a future, it would be built by people like Senna who understood that some things remained worth dying for. Dr. Chen's evening radio transmission provided their final intelligence update. "Research notes have been compiled and secured," her tired voice reported through increasing static. "Primary data is stored in multiple formats for redundancy. If you're planning a rescue attempt, please know that the work can be completed elsewhere. Our facility is compromised, but the knowledge can survive." The message carried an undertone of finality that suggested Dr. Chen's situation had deteriorated significantly since their first contact. Time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated, which meant their mission window was narrowing to a matter of hours rather than days. Standing in the sanctuary surrounded by their makeshift family, Kestrel felt the familiar mix of terror and determination that preceded every dangerous mission. But this time was different. This time they weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the possibility that humanity might have a future worth surviving into. The hospital loomed against the pre-dawn sky like a monument to civilization's hubris, its concrete and glass facade now serving as a fortress for the infected. From their observation point 3 blocks away, Kestrel could see movement in almost every visible window, the endless shuffle of creatures that had once been patients, staff, and visitors, now trapped in an eternal mockery of their former lives. Manuel had proven surprisingly spry during their approach, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that noise meant death. His presence had already paid dividends when he'd identified a service tunnel leading from the hospital's old power plant to its basement levels. The tunnel had been used for utility maintenance before the outbreak, and it remained largely intact despite months of urban decay. "The infected congregate where they died," Indira observed, studying movement patterns through binoculars. "Emergency room, intensive care, surgical suites. The areas where people fought hardest to stay alive now hold the most danger." This observation guided their infiltration route away from the hospital's main clinical areas toward the research wings, where Dr. Chen's laboratory had been conducting experimental treatments when the outbreak began. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that their salvation might come from the very place where the infection had been studied in its earliest stages. Zephyr's voice crackled through their radio earpieces as they prepared to enter the service tunnel. "Dr. Chen's morning transmission just came through. She reports that one of her team members has been infected but is showing unusual resistance to full transformation. They're calling it a slow-burn infection that might provide crucial data for treatment development." The news was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. Evidence of infection resistance could represent the breakthrough they desperately needed, but it also meant that time was running out for Dr. Chen's team faster than anyone had anticipated. If the slow burn infection accelerated, they might arrive to find only another group of infected waiting in the laboratory. The service tunnel reeked of stagnant water and decay, but it remained blessedly empty of infected presence. Manuel's knowledge of hospital infrastructure proved invaluable as he guided them through maintenance corridors that bypassed the main elevator systems. His whispered instructions, translated by Esperanza over radio, helped them navigate past potential choke points where infected might have gathered. Grandfather says the research floors were always kept separate from patient areas, Esperanza's voice reported. Different air systems, different access routes. The doctors didn't want contamination between experimental areas and regular hospital operations. This architectural segregation became their salvation as they climbed through service stairwells that showed minimal signs of infected occupation. The creatures seemed drawn to areas where human activity had been highest, while the sterile research corridors held little appeal for minds driven by vestigial memories of living interaction. Lyra's sound-dampening device performed flawlessly during their ascent, masking their footsteps and whispered communications from the enhanced hearing that some infected had developed. The technology wouldn't last much longer, but it had bought them precious time to reach the 7th floor without triggering a feeding frenzy that would bring every infected in the building down upon them. Dr. Chen's laboratory occupied the corner of the research wing, its reinforced doors sealed with electronic locks that still functioned despite the building's deteriorated condition. Through the observation window, they could see 4 figures in hazmat suits working frantically over laboratory equipment, their movements conveying the desperate urgency of people racing against time. Kestrel knocked softly on the laboratory door, using the pattern that Dr. Chen had specified in her radio transmissions. The response was immediate. One of the suited figures approached the door, removing her helmet to reveal an Asian woman in her 40s with exhausted eyes that held equal measures of hope and despair. "Are you real?" Dr. Chen asked through the door's communication system, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've been hearing voices for days, but we weren't sure if we were hallucinating from sleep deprivation." "We're real," Kestrel confirmed. "We're here to get you out and preserve your research. What's your current status?" The answer came in rapid, clinical terms that spoke to Dr. Chen's medical training even under extreme stress. 4 team members remaining. 1 infected with slow burn variant, still cognitive but transformation accelerating. Research data compiled and backed up in multiple formats. We have perhaps 6 hours before building security systems fail completely. 6 hours to extract 4 people, safeguard research that might save humanity, and escape through a building filled with thousands of infected. The timeline was impossibly tight, but it was what they had to work with. In this new world, impossible had become merely another word for Tuesday. "Dr. Chen," Indira's voice came through their communication system, "this is Dr. Indira Vasquez. I'm here with the extraction team. We need you to prepare your research materials for immediate transport. Priority items only, what absolutely cannot be recreated elsewhere." The response revealed the true scope of their discovery. "The slow burn infection data is irreplaceable," Dr. Chen replied. "We've isolated the mechanism that causes partial resistance. With proper facilities, we believe we can develop a treatment that prevents full transformation, maybe even reverses early-stage infection." Standing in the hallway outside a laboratory that might hold humanity's salvation, surrounded by the moans of the infected and the distant sounds of building systems failing, Kestrel felt the weight of history settling on her shoulders. Their next few hours would determine whether the human race had a future beyond mere survival. The world was falling apart, but these humans, scientists and survivors, old and young, connected by bonds stronger than blood, were about to give it one last, desperate chance to heal. The extraction proceeded with methodical precision born from months of desperate improvisation. Dr. Chen's team had compressed their research into portable drives and handwritten notebooks, the accumulated knowledge of 93 days of intensive study condensed into packages small enough to carry during a running battle. The slow burn infected team member, Dr. Marcus Williams, remained lucid enough to assist with data compilation despite the gray pallor creeping across his skin. The transformation process varies significantly between individuals, Dr. Williams explained as they prepared for departure, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a researcher discussing his own condition. I estimate I have perhaps 12 hours before cognitive function becomes too impaired for meaningful communication. The data we've gathered from my condition could accelerate treatment development by months. His calm acceptance of approaching transformation spoke to the same courage that had led their rescue mission into the heart of infected territory. Some people, Kestrel realized, were simply built to sacrifice themselves for others. Dr. Williams had become a living laboratory, documenting his own decline to save strangers he would never meet. The building's security systems chose that moment to fail catastrophically. Emergency lighting flickered and died, plunging the corridors into darkness broken only by their portable illumination. More critically, the electronic locks that had secured various containment areas began to disengage, releasing infected that had been trapped since the initial outbreak. "Time to go," Thane's voice crackled through their radios from the command post. Building sensors show massive movement throughout all floors. Whatever was keeping them contained just stopped working. Their planned extraction route through the service corridors became impossible as infected began flooding through previously secured areas. Manuel's knowledge of hospital architecture suggested an alternative, the helicopter landing pad on the roof, accessible through the trauma surgery stairwells that had been designed for emergency access. The ascent became a nightmare of close encounters and whispered prayers. Infected poured from every doorway, their moans echoing through stairwells like a chorus of the damned. Lyra's sound-dampening device had long since exhausted its power, forcing them to rely on speed and luck rather than stealth. Dr. Williams, despite his deteriorating condition, proved surprisingly capable in combat, using his medical knowledge to identify vulnerable points on infected anatomy. "They retain muscle memory," he observed during a brief respite between floors, "but lose higher reasoning. Exploit the gap between instinct and strategy." His clinical analysis of infected behavior even while becoming one of them demonstrated the kind of intellectual courage that had made the research possible in the first place. The roof access door had been barricaded from the inside, evidence of other survivors who had sought escape through the helicopter pad. Their improvised barriers told a story of hope and ultimate failure, but they also provided defensive positions that could be repurposed for their own survival. The morning sun revealed the full scope of Portland's transformation, with infected filling every street like a gray tide that had swallowed civilization. Zephyr's voice reached them through radio static, his fever-weakened transmission barely audible. "Extraction helicopter is 20 minutes out. Weather conditions deteriorating rapidly. Visibility dropping and wind speeds increasing. Pilot says this might be his last run before conditions become impossible. 20 minutes to hold a rooftop against an endless tide of infected, while protecting research data that represented humanity's best hope for survival." The helicopter pad offered no cover except what they could improvise from abandoned medical equipment and the structural elements of the building itself. Dr. Chen used the time to make final preparations with her research materials, sealing data drives in waterproof containers and creating multiple backup copies of critical information. "Even if some of us don't make it," she said quietly, "the research must survive. Too many people died to gather this knowledge." Manuel surprised everyone by producing seeds from his pockets, vegetables and medicinal plants that he'd carefully preserved during their months of survival. For the new place, Esperanza translated, her grandfather's words carrying hopes that transcended the immediate crisis. "He says every garden needs seeds to begin again." The infected breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. Rather than ascending through the stairwells they'd been monitoring, a group of enhanced infected had learned to climb the building's exterior, using fire escapes and window ledges to reach the roof level. Their coordination suggested intelligence that went far beyond anything previously observed. "They're learning from each other," Dr. Williams noted with scientific fascination even as he helped barricade the roof access. "Information transfer between infected individuals. It's like they're developing a collective intelligence." The final battle was brief but intense. Infected swarmed across the rooftop while their small group fought with desperation born from protecting irreplaceable knowledge. Dr. Williams made the ultimate sacrifice, deliberately allowing himself to be overwhelmed while ensuring that the research materials remained secure. His last coherent words were coordinates for a backup research facility where the work could continue. The helicopter extraction succeeded with mere seconds to spare, lifting them away from the rooftop as infected continued pouring from the building below. But their victory was bittersweet. Dr. Williams was gone, consumed by the transformation he had studied so carefully. Dr. Chen's team was reduced to 3, carrying research that might save the world but had already cost so much. Flying over the infected wasteland that had once been their city, Kestrel found herself thinking about the question Lyra had asked days earlier. Had they done the right thing, risking everything for people they didn't know? Looking at Dr. Chen clutching her research materials while tears streamed down her face, listening to Manuel speak softly about planting gardens in their new sanctuary, she knew the answer. The world was falling apart, but humanity endured in the small acts of courage that connected strangers across the vast darkness. They had saved more than research data and human lives. They had preserved the fundamental belief that tomorrow might be better than today, that hope could survive even when everything else had died. As the helicopter carried them toward an uncertain future, Esperanza pressed her face against the window, watching the infected city disappear behind them. "Grandfather says the world isn't ending," she translated quietly. "He says it's just changing, and we get to help decide what grows in the new one." The seeds in Manuel's pocket, the research data in Dr. Chen's hands, the children who still believed in bedtime stories, these were the tools they would use to rebuild. The world was falling apart, but these humans had found something worth saving in the ruins. Hope, it turned out, was the most resilient infection of all.